critical face-to-face talks to try to end the war with Iran are now just one day away. Vice President Vance just left for Pakistan, where he will lead the U.S. delegation for this administration's third attempt at forging a deal with Iran. Now, the pause in fighting that set up these negotiations is just a couple of days old and already teetering due to Israel's continued bombardment of Lebanon and the virtual standstill in the Strait of Hormuz. Those complicating factors and more are now on the VP's plate. And we have new reporting about the precarious position President Trump has put him in as a once vocal critic of exactly this type of U.S. military venture. Let's discuss with MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai, our White House reporter Jake Traylor in Washington, and MS Now international affairs analyst, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. So, Jake, you have some great behind-the-scenes details about this decision to have VP Vance lead these talks. Take us through it.
Yeah, Anna, it's really interesting, and essentially the tightrope is a great way to describe what Vice President Vance is doing right now inside the White House. He, for years, has been the leading dissenter on any type of military foreign involvement, especially inside this White House. Now he is headed to Pakistan to be the chief lead negotiator for a war he never wanted in the first place, and that has come at a cost. I spoke with multiple White House officials inside the White House and also former White House officials that have worked with Vance closely before. One person told me that, quote, Vance's national security team is extremely weary right now, trying to publicly portray support for the president and the war that he has started, but also privately having deep concern for the war itself. Another White House official told me that, quote, realistically, Vance has lost clout within the White House because of his dissent. So there's been a lack of influence that White House officials are telling me Vance has right now, even though he is ultimately the lead negotiator in this moment. And another official highlighted how different this looks in a Trump White House, especially in a second term, as opposed to his first or another president altogether. They told me that normally whenever there's a voice of dissent or someone who maybe disagrees in a situation room, that would help lead to a greater outcome, some nuance, some context that would ultimately lead the president to make the wisest decision possible. They said in this White House, that actually looks quite different. They said, quote, 7 years ago, you would have had a lot more outspoken voices referencing the war. This time around, that's not the case. Vance privately, sometimes quietly voiced some of that concern, but ultimately he's still the one leading the negotiations, and so it's going to make for a really pivotal moment come Saturday.
Ambassador, obviously the Iranians know what the vice president has said, his public positions when it comes to foreign involvement. And twice before, U.S. negotiations with Iran have ended in surprise attacks by Israel and the U.S. Given this slight shakeup in who the White House is sending with Vance added to the mix, what does that signal now to the Iranian delegation?
Well, first on our side, I just want to underscore how unusual it is that the vice president of the United States of America is leading a foreign negotiation. Nobody from the State Department is there. That's usually the job of the Secretary of State. Sometimes none of the specialists on Iran, to the best of my knowledge, are part of this negotiation. Mr. Witkoff and Kushner, I guess, are there, but they haven't been very successful in negotiating with the Russians, I would just underscore. So it's unusual on our side. But from the Iranian perspective, it means that we're taking it very seriously, that we're sending the vice president to negotiate. And I think that makes their situation easier. I think that gives them leverage that we look like we're so desperate for a deal.
Inzamam, on the eve of these talks, is there any more clarity about the potential terms and on the status of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, Anna, I've been speaking to the Pakistanis today, and they seem very positive. They seem very hopeful, as they would. They are the ones mediating these talks. They're the host nation, so they want it to go well. There has been, following on from Jake's reporting, there has been some big question marks over whether Iran will actually attend. I do think that they will follow through. But there has, it seems, been some disagreements amongst the senior leadership inside of Iran. But one source inside Tehran, a foreign diplomat source, telling me today that everything seems to be on track to go ahead. This source added that these talks were meant to be about how to work towards a permanent ceasefire following the initial 2-week pause in fighting and opening up of the Strait of Hormuz. But the issue of Lebanon and the waterway are two gigantic tasks that need to be resolved immediately. So a lot of the focus will be on that. So clearly, this source telling me that those two elements, Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz, is what will be discussed initially before they go on to have any permanent ceasefire conversations. On the point of the Strait of Hormuz, Anna, there are still around 800 or so vessels parked up at the entrance of that waterway to pass through. Only one oil tanker managed to go through in the last 24 hours, which tells you that Iran still very much is controlling that waterway, and there is no real sign of an uptick in traffic across that waterway. Iran really seems to be taking advantage of controlling it economically as well. We've heard multiple times that they've said that they will charge a toll for ships to pass through. And then overnight, we actually heard, well, didn't hear directly, but read posts from the Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei. We have not seen him since his father was killed in the first few days of this conflict, remember. And he said that we will definitely take the management of the Strait of Hormuz to a new phase. So I think clearly in any permanent peace talks that may take place this weekend, the Strait of Hormuz and how Iran wants to run it and control it will be very high on their agenda. I don't think that will be received well by the United States or, in fact, the Gulf states, who are here effectively on the sideline and will be watching carefully what happens this weekend. But those 2 points clearly will be the talking point: Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz, Anna.
There are moments in international politics when events feel less like coordinated strategy and more like improvisation under pressure. This appears to be one of them. Sending J.D. Vance to lead high-stakes negotiations despite his prior skepticism of the war itself captures the contradiction at the heart of the current situation. It is not just a diplomatic mission, it is a political balancing act. On one level, this move signals urgency. When a vice president is dispatched to negotiate, it suggests the stakes are too high for routine channels. But urgency can easily be mistaken for desperation. And in diplomacy, perception matters as much as substance. If one side believes the other needs a deal more, leverage quietly shifts. What complicates matters further is the widening gap between what is being said publicly and what may be happening privately. Claims of optimism, shifting definitions of success, and unclear negotiation goals create an environment where even allies struggle to interpret the strategy. For adversaries, that ambiguity becomes an opportunity. Then there is the structural problem. Too many issues have been bundled into a single negotiation. What began as a conflict tied to security concerns has now expanded to include control over critical waterways, regional proxy conflicts, and economic leverage. When everything becomes a priority, nothing is easily resolved. The more complex the agenda, the more fragile the outcome. The situation around the Strait of Hormuz illustrates this perfectly. What was once a stable artery of global trade is now a bargaining chip. That shift alone represents a significant strategic change, regardless of how the negotiations unfold. It shows how quickly realities on the ground can redefine what is even being negotiated. At the same time, the internal dynamics on both sides add another layer of uncertainty. Questions about authority, consistency, and decision-making make it difficult to know whether any agreement reached will actually hold. Diplomacy relies on trust in process as much as trust in outcome, and both appear strained. Ultimately, this is not just a test of negotiation skill, it is a test of coherence. Without clear objectives, consistent messaging, and realistic expectations, even the most high-profile talks risk becoming symbolic rather than substantive. And symbolism in a conflict this volatile is not enough to secure lasting stability.